Well, we're live here in lockdown Children's Lit Fest. I cannot remember which week we're on, never mind which day. So
289.
something like that. So hi, Gill. Today we're joined by GIll Arbuthnott.
Hi.
Sorry, am I
Hello,
pronouncing your name?
Catherine.
Am I
Yes, you are.
pronouncing
You're
your name?
pronouncing it perfectly, yes.
Lovely. Um, I'm Catherine Miller. I've been a teacher for about 20 years. I actually trained in Scotland, but the West Coast in Glasgow. And I have been teaching for about 20 years, and I'm now a school consultant going in and helping schools promote reading for pleasure, because motivating children to read is the one thing that really makes a massive difference in children's primary education. So at the moment, if you're stuck in lockdown with children at home, the best thing that you can do for yourself and for them is get them reading, get into books, because it will just buy you a little bit of free time. Everyone will chill out. Just reading's the best thing ever. So, Gill, would you like to give us a bit of background, a bit of information about yourself?
Yeah, I would love to. I'm Edinburgh born and bred, and I went north to St Andrews to study zoology there, which is not about zookeeping, despite what most people seem to think. And then I went down to Southampton for a couple of years to do some research there, and then came back up to Scotland and started teaching. And I have to admit, teaching was not something I really wanted to do, but it was a job, so I took it and then discovered I really, really enjoyed it. But all the time, since primary school, I used to write stories. So this was always going on in the background. And always at the back of my mind this was what I would really like to do. I would like to be a writer. But I didn't tell anyone about that because I hadn't studied English at university. So I felt I'd be unmasked as a complete fraud if I told anyone else about it. So this went on for years. I was teaching biology, and at night I would secretly be writing, this is really tragic, while pretending to mark schoolwork. And if anyone else came into the room, I would quickly pull the marking down over what I was doing. So that went on and on and on. And I started to send off novels and get rejections. And it wasn't until I wrote a book called The Chaos Clock that I'd thought of writing for children. I'd been trying to write for adults before then. The Chaos Clock, as I was writing it, turned itself into a children's book. And I sent it off to Flores Books in Edinburgh. And the day after we moved house, when I was in the house on my own, got a letter saying they would like to publish it. So I had to come clean to my family then, and they were really quite surprised to find that I'd been maniacally writing away for years and years and years. We're very puzzled as to why I'd kept it such a secret, and I can see why they were puzzled. There's really nothing shameful. But whenever I do events now and I talk about this, there's almost always somebody who shuffles up to me afterwards and said, I write secretly as well. So I think it's a far more widespread thing than we realise. So that was how it all began for me, and it began with fiction. And then I started to do non-fiction books as well. And that I can remember when that happened, I was at a book launch and a fellow author said to me, have you thought of writing a biology book? And I assumed she meant a textbook. And I remember saying I would sooner stick needles in my own eyes. And then she said, no, I didn't mean a textbook, a science book that somebody might actually pick up for pleasure. And I thought, well, that's a great idea, because I couldn't agree more with what you were saying about reading, and I'll come back to that. But I also think science is fantastic and ought to be thrilling. I thought, well, maybe I could actually write some science books that people would like. And bizarrely, I ended up writing about the man who really did stick needles in his own eyes in one of my science books. Ooh. So that's how it all began.
Ooh, I don't think I want to hear that story. I'm a little bit squeamish about that.
School kids love that story, I tell you.
They do. So
there's a question. See if anybody listening knows who it was.
Which book was that in?
That was in a book here called Mad Scientists, which I wrote for Barrington Stoke. And having spent a long time teaching science, you get to hear about the discoveries, but you very seldom hear anything about the people behind them. And some of them are the most fantastically eccentric personalities. There are some fabulous stories. And that book could have been about 5 times as thick. Oh, and it's something I would like to pursue a bit more, because I always used to tell the people I was teaching about the scientists and the crazy things, and that it makes it far more interesting. They love a good anecdote, I think.
Absolutely. Well, stories bring things to life, don't they?
Yes, and it's a mistake to think there aren't stories in non-fiction. There are just as much.
Absolutely. Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, do you know, I might look into that and get my daughter to read it and find out about that, because I'm quite curious. So, and I love I think that there's been a real turning point in publishing for children over that, well, certainly since I've been a teacher, with the types of books that you've been writing. And they're just so much more engaging and more accessible for children. I've found that particularly reluctant readers gravitate towards non-fiction texts. Have you found that as well?
Well, yes. The first non-fiction I did was for Barrington Stoke, who specialise in books for reluctant readers. But in fact, they were being read very widely outside of that sort of target group. And at the risk of making a terrible generalisation, I think there are boys who would not be happy reading fiction who will happily dive into some sort of non-fiction book. And for a lot of people who don't enjoy trying to keep a whole novel plot in their head, a non-fiction book that you can dip in and out of at random is a way into reading. I get quite exercised when I do school visits and ask who likes reading, and there will always be some people who claim they don't. And if you unpick that a bit, it becomes apparent that quite a lot of kids think it only counts if it's a novel. Yeah. So I'm always saying, non-fiction counts, graphic novels count, magazines, comics, websites, newspapers. It's all reading, it's all words, it all counts.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of adults think that too. And they think, I don't read, but then actually they'll spend hours reading newspapers or online, or for pleasure, but because they don't read novels, they don't see themselves as readers.
Cookery books count too.
Yes, yeah. How important do you think the layout of non-fiction books is for children, and how hard is it to design the books when you're writing?
I think the layout and the design makes a huge difference to getting someone to open them for a start. That is what will attract people. You've got to make it look attractive on the shelf before someone will pick it up and open it. I am the world's least artistic and design person. It's you would only have to ask anyone I ever taught about my diagrams on the board, and you'd find that. So I have very little to do with the design. I just go, ooh, it's wonderful when it comes back. But I've been very fortunate in the companies I've worked with recently on non-fiction who've done a fantastic job. And if I can just show you, I've got a couple of them here. This is one of the books I did for Bloomsbury. This was the first one I did for them. This is all about DNA, which is one of the things I really love. And it's fantastically colourful, all sorts of really attractive illustrations. And I think even if you thought you weren't interested in the topic, that would really engage you. My most recent non-fiction book is this magnificent one, which was brought out to, it wasn't brought out just in honour of the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, but it was certainly timed to come out then. And this was done, this is actually won a prize for book design, and quite rightly so. And the designers at Bonnier Templar who did that, and also the fantastic illustrator, Chris Nielsen, they've given it such a wonderful sort of retro look. And that's been commented on enormously. And I'm just in awe of people who can do that, because it's so far away from any skill set that I have.
It is beautiful. It's really a thing of beauty, isn't it? There are so many kind of coffee table books now for children.
Yes.
That wouldn't look remiss in the chicest Parisian salon. So, and do you write the text as you imagine, as it ends up on the page, or how do you do it?
I write a first draft, given an idea of the word count, and then we probably have a flat plan where I will lay out roughly what the topics would be on each double page spread, and then I'll write that, and it will go back and forth between me and my editor. several times. That's a process that takes quite a lot of iterations. And at the same time, the editor will be briefing designers and illustrator. So it all comes together, and then I will see layouts with the illustrations in, which I get to comment on. But really, I'm just going, ooh, ah, they're lovely, unless there's something that scientifically isn't right. The only one of, no, not the only one, but one of the ones that I really thought, that can't happen is the sort of classic of having the polar bear and the penguin in the same picture as if they're together, which, there's always some eagle-eyed reader who will spot everything. So you have to try and anticipate that. But there's a lot of cooperation, collaboration in doing that, even though you could be on the other side of the world. The illustrator for Balloon to the Moon lives in Sydney, Australia. So I won't be seeing him anytime soon. And the illustrator for this one lives in Spain. So I've never met him. The only illustrator I've met is Darren Gates, who's illustrated the history book that I've done, which was another very different thing for me to do, being a biologist.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. There's so many interesting points that you've brought up there. I've got lots of questions. So the fact-checking, thinking about the children because children are the most eagle-eyed, critical, greatest fact-checkers ever. How crucial is, I mean, obviously it's completely crucial in a non-fiction book where you're teaching facts. How do you ensure that your research is thorough enough to make sure that you don't make any of those crucial scientific errors?
Yes, that's always a nightmare, that somebody will spot them after the book's gone to press. It depends on how much I know about the topic to start with. Doing the biology-based ones, obviously I've got a decent background knowledge, so that makes life a bit simpler. Doing the Balloon to the Moon, I didn't know much about space or physics. I certainly knew very little about history. So you've got to be aware, first of all, of all the sources that you have. And while for most people nowadays, the internet is probably their number one, I like to read ink and paper books as well. And there are often very good things on YouTube. I spent a lot of time watching Walter Cronkite commenting on the Apollo moon missions, which was fantastic, just to give that sense of immediacy. There are often good documentaries that you can look at. And of course, there are people, and they tend to be the most underestimated resource. Whatever you want to know, there will be someone out there who knows all about it. And in my experience, they are not only willing to tell you, they're delighted to share their knowledge, and they're fantastic. I can't tell you how marvelous people are. When you're using the internet, of course, it's very easy to get snowed under by information, and the trick is knowing which of it is reliable. And I know in schools and in quite a lot of places, they say never use Wikipedia. I don't actually agree with that. I think Wikipedia, if you want an overview of something, is a good way in, and it will tell you things quite simply, but you must never trust that it's correct. Most of it is, but you can't tell the stuff that's correct from the stuff that's wrong. So you then have to go and dig around and look at other websites and check that they're saying the same thing. You also have to think about who is the website. Is it somebody reliable, or is it just somebody's personal blog? Is it a government thing? I used a lot of NASA information, Smithsonian, National Geographic, places like that are much more reliable than just somebody's WordPress blog. So you have to weigh up the likelihood that things are correct. And sometimes you have to leave stuff out because you can't quite find enough confirmation that they're true. I had to leave out one of my favorite things I found out about First World War because I just couldn't find quite enough to convince me it was real.
Oh, can you tell us that now?
Yes, that was a lot of the soldiers, when they were in the reserve trenches, they had little gardens growing to supply them with fresh vegetables. So that's definitely true. But there's also a story which circulates quite widely, and if anybody out there knows that this is true, I'd love to hear it, that one of the Gloucester regiments kept a cow in the reserve trenches for milk.
Wow.
I love the idea.
So
I've
sorry. That really gives the sense that they were there for a really long, sustained period.
Oh, yes. Yes, it does.
Because
I found that in a way, I found the history book most fascinating because it was the thing I knew least about before I started.
So how did that come about? You writing a non-fiction book about something that wasn't a speciality for you?
Well, my fiction publisher in Scotland, Floris, decided to start a non-fiction Scottish history imprint called Factastic Stories. And they decided the first book should be about the First World War, and they wanted it to come out in time for the 100th anniversary of the end of the war. And frankly, I think I was the only non-fiction author on their books. So they said, would I be interested? And I said, yes. And then through all sorts of coincidences, I was given an absolute gift of a story. To cut a long story short, I was put in touch with the Royal Scots Museum at Edinburgh Castle, and they produced a diary kept by a teenage boy from just outside Edinburgh who had fought on the Western Front for the whole of the war. And he'd gone there aged 14, but he'd gone legally. Everybody knew what age he was. He hadn't lied his way in. And he kept this extraordinary diary of his experiences, survived the war, brought it back, and his family agreed to me using his story as the spine of the book. And what a privilege it was.
Absolutely. That's given me goosebumps. That's a wonderful story.
Oh, it is.
So your book is basically true.
Oh yes, it's absolutely true, and
Right.
it uses his diary entries. I feel I didn't really write the book at all; it wrote itself. It uses his diary entries. Obviously, we couldn't fit the whole lot in, unfortunately. There's a much longer book about him waiting to be written, so they were just compressed a little bit. And in the same way that if you were, I suppose, writing a film, you would slightly alter things without altering the truth of them, just to make the drama more compelling, but there wasn't even much need to do that.
And I guess it's almost like Anne Frank's diary, where that was edited.
Yes,
literally.
Oh, certainly talking to people about it, and I've spoken to everything from primary 3 pupils to adult history societies about this book, and the fact that it is based around this one real person just engages people so much more than a simple factual book about the First World War would. That they know it's true, they know it happened to someone not far from their age if they're a school pupil.
Absolutely. Well, Sharon's commented to saying, thank you. Hi, Sharon, thank you for commenting. She's saying, wow, that's given her chills too.
Well, it keeps giving me chills as well.
I think my daughter's 15 at the moment, so that's, immediately popped into my head, the fact that that could have been her generation. Well,
yeah.
It would have been her, yeah. That's just, it makes, it roots the story in reality, doesn't it? When you...
Oh, yes, completely.
So do you think you would go on to write other history books?
Well, I am actually. I'm editing one in the same series on Mary Queen of Scots at the moment. It will be out next year. So I knew, everyone knows a little bit about Mary Queen of Scots, but again, I think we tend to forget how young she was. She was only 18 when she came back to Scotland to rule. She was just a teenager.
Yeah.
And when you think of her in that way, it perhaps makes some of her story a bit more explainable in terms of the decisions she made.
Yeah. And the fact that she was a woman as well, just, in a...
Oh, yes. That's quite an extraordinary time with her on the throne of Scotland and at one time France, and Elizabeth in England.
Yeah.
For the time, it's absolutely extraordinary that they should both be ruling. Shame it didn't work out better.
Absolutely. Do you have... when you talk about the collaboration with people, do you get the do they comment and edit your text as well as you getting the chance to comment on their input? Is it
I've not had that happen with design or illustrators, except in the sense that there's not room for this amount of words on the page, you need to cut it down. Be very happy. I'm always very happy for anyone to suggest an improvement, or certainly for anyone to point out anything I've got wrong. I don't think it's happened yet, but yes, sometime I'm sure it will, and it'd be very welcome.
And how do you write? How do you structure your time writing?
Now that I'm no longer teaching, I have an actual place of my own to write rather than just writing on the sofa, which I used to do. So I tend to get down to it first thing in the morning. But before we went into the awfulness, as Caitlin Moran calls it, I used to go to the gym or go for a swim first thing. Then I would come back and get down to work. So now I go for a very slow, very short jog, or go for a walk and then come back. And I certainly think I work better in the morning, certainly on the non-fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And just depending on how it's going, I may be back at it in the afternoon. Sometimes I'm back at it in the evening. It depends on deadlines and so on. But at least I've got the luxury of flexibility now. Normally I wouldn't have so much time because I'd be doing school visits, but not just now.
Absolutely. It's a shame about that. Sharon's asking, could I ask you who approaches museums and other organisations for your source material? Do you do that, or would the publishers do that?
It's up to the author to do that. I've certainly always done that. I'm sure there will be occasions when the publishers have contacts and you'll happily share them. But it's been me who's approached people. And, I cannot show enough gratitude for how generous people are with their knowledge. And again, It comes from the most extraordinary places. I wanted to find out a little bit about Elsie Inglis, the Scottish doctor, and discovered that the absolute world expert, is a guy who's a landscape gardener in, I think, Glenrothes. I hope you'll excuse me if I've got that wrong. And he first came across her when he went to Serbia as a football fan to watch Scotland play, and could see all these statues and plaques in her honour everywhere, and had never heard of her, and came back to Scotland. I mean, she's revered there, and came back to Scotland, found out all about her, and he's now the sort of acknowledged world expert. And that's a fascinating story in its own right.
Absolutely.
There are stories everywhere.
So what is she known for?
For being a sort of, I suppose, a battlefield medic.
Right.
Yes. But she wasn't allowed, the British medical establishment turned her down, told her to go home. So she gathered together other female medics and they went off notably to Serbia. And this was in the First World War again, and were hugely, hugely helpful, and provided a lot of medical care for the Serbian army.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I do hope I've got all that right. It's a while since I read any of this. Please don't shoot me down in flames if I got it wrong, someone.
Not at all. I think that's fascinating how stories come about just from kind of little chance meetings.
Yeah.
I know my brother was, he was a caver in his youth, and also works in quarries, so knows a fair bit about explosives. So the in Durham, they were contacted by by some people in a village in France, where they would occasionally have an unexploded World War I bomb go off as a cow marched across the field, and they had this kind of just a tunnel opening in the middle of the village, and no one really knew what it was, or so it was the Durham Light Infantry who had been out there in the First World War, which was kind of the connection with Durham. And my brother ended up going as part of a team to excavate some of these First World War tunnels.
Wow.
And in the war, underneath the trenches, they dug down, and they were all pitmen in coal miners from Durham, and then they tunnelled underneath the no man's land and placed bombs underneath the trenches where the Germans were, and the Germans did the same. So my brother was involved in this really fantastic project, just trying to map all the underground chambers, and he would find hand grenades and all sorts of things. So
what a fantastic thing.
Mm-hmm. And then when I was chatting to my husband's uncle, he's a big First World War history buff, and you find these really fascinating old men who just have this encyclopedic knowledge about what went on. So he was then telling me, oh, well, that was that battle, and giving me all the facts and figures.
Yeah, when I was researching this, when I read about the tunnelers, I thought that was the absolutely most horrific job you could possibly have had, the dangers you were facing there.
Well, I think the danger, I mean, aside from the artillery explosions, I think the dangers of tunneling were not dissimilar to their normal lives in the coal mines, wherever they were based at home.
Yeah, minus the danger that the other side, if the tunnels met, were horrific underground hand-to-hand battles as well.
Yeah.
Ironically, my boy James, his dad was a miner, and James and his brother both survived the First World War, and their father was killed in a pit accident while they were in France.
Wow. Gosh. Just gives you food to think. And I think that these stories are so powerful for children. And quite often I found, especially, you know, we talked about reluctant readers before. I've found when I've been teaching that for those reluctant readers, it can be a way into reading itself. When they come across these stories that hook them in and grip them, then it provides a gateway into other books and other reading.
Yeah, that's wonderful. If any of my books ever do that, I could ask for nothing more. So
do you prefer writing what you know about, or do you prefer researching other topics?
It depends what the other topics are. It's fascinating to learn new stuff, always fascinating. And I did love the historical research. I hated history at school, and then I got into historical novels. So most of my historical knowledge comes from them. But that's got me interested in the actual history. And you know, I've written bits of fiction that haven't been published, sadly, but they've had historical settings, and I've really, really enjoyed going down the research rabbit hole for that. Doing research for science, it's quite different. It's harder to put the story into it, which is something I always want to do. But it's definitely possible. What I was saying about you're looking at the personalities of the scientists and so on, and some of the topics, some of the spreads in the Moon book have been done as comic strips, which is a great way to put the story across. And that was a very, very new thing for me, to be trying to write in that way, and I've found that very, very difficult. So I'm awestruck by people who can write comics, graphic novel type things, because I really can't quite get my head around that at all. I think because I've got no visual imagination, or at least no ability to draw.
Well, I've spoken to a couple of authors in this series who have written graphic novels as well. And, you know, talking to you, I find it fascinating talking about non-fiction books and your experience of creating those. But they said Mo O'Hara has a theatrical background. She was an actor before she was writing. And she said for her, writing a graphic novel is just like writing a script for a play.
Right.
Because she loves writing dialogue, she finds writing graphic novels really easy because that's what comes naturally to her. But I, like you, would find it
well, I like writing dialogue in my fiction. I really like that, but I don't know. I think it's just something I've got so little practice at. Perhaps I'll get better.
Well, maybe
we're having some of that in the next book in the series. The Moon book was first, and next we're having one about undersea exploration, and there are going to be a couple of comic strips in that, including a fantastic story about a submarine rescue, which I would never have known about, except my husband came rushing through one night to haul me through to watch a documentary about it, and it's the most phenomenal adventure rescue story.
Oh, fantastic. So what will that book be called?
It's called From Shore to Ocean Floor.
Oh, brilliant.
That will be out next year.
Oh, we'll look forward to that. So, and tell us about your fiction writing. You said you started off writing fiction, well, for adults, and then you moved to writing for children.
Yes, and I wrote some novels for sort of 8 to 12-year-olds, and I like to write fantasy, but I like to set it in the real world. It's not sort of elves and dwarves and talking trees sort of fantasy. And in Edinburgh, there's a brilliant museum, and for the millennium, a group of craftsmen, I suppose you would say, called Sharmanka, a big cooperative, designed this extraordinary clock which stands in the museum. It's like 3 stories high, and it's incredibly complex. It's got mirrors, it's got chains, it's got a pendulum that's a convex mirror with a skeleton sitting on the top. Charlie Chaplin's in there, Stalin's in there. There are so many stories in there, and I just thought, right, I'm having one of those stories, and began to write this book. And it was set in Edinburgh, and it was the idea that time was rather loosely tied down in Edinburgh, so the past and the present could mix up. And yeah, it became an adventure story with that. But I learned an important thing when writing that book, that even in fiction, if you say something's true, somebody will pull you up on it if it's not, because my 2 protagonists were 11. Now, my daughter was about the same age at that time, and both my children were very keen on football, and I knew nothing about football, but I thought, well, they've got to have something to chat about in this book, so I'll make one of them follow one of the teams in Edinburgh and the other one follow the other one. So one was a Heart of Midlothian supporter, one of them was a Hibs supporter. And then I just made up some matches and made up some scores. And about less than a week after the book came out, I got a phone call, rather irate phone call, from the football correspondent of the Scotsman newspaper to say, this book's set in 2000, isn't it? I said, yes. He said, you've made it sound as if Hearts had a dreadful season, and it's not true. And it had never, this is how little I knew about football, it had never occurred to me, A, that anyone would notice, and B, that anyone would care, even if they did notice. So I took a vow then never to write another word about football as long as I live. And it's made me a bit more cautious about claiming things, even in fiction.
Oh, absolutely. I can completely understand, having lived in Glasgow for a number of years. And I taught in one school that was in the East End and one school that was in the West End. So yeah, there were Rangers fans and Celtic fans, and never the two may meet. So
actually, my pupils at school, the school I taught at was mainly a boys' school, and they used to have, there was one class in particular who had a competition going about who could ask me the most, to their mind, extraordinarily obvious question about football that I wouldn't be able to answer. They couldn't believe the depth of my ignorance.
They make it their job to educate you.
Yes.
I had a wonderful experience of teaching phonics in Glasgow, and I was in an estate where their accent was extremely broad, and me being a Yorkshire lad, I learnt very quickly to speak broad Glaswegian.
So you're bilingual then?
Absolutely. They wouldn't have been able to cope learning my phonics and having an English accent when they were reading. So we've mentioned lockdown briefly. What's been your experience of lockdown? What have been the worst and the best bits for you?
I've really missed going out and doing school events. I do quite a lot of them, and it's great to get the feedback from readers, actually. Having children as readers is great because they're very honest. If they think something's boring, they will tell you. And that's marvellous because you don't do the same thing twice. You don't make that mistake again.
Is it different going into school as a teacher?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you with another question when I've asked you a different question. Is it different going into a school as an author than a teacher?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's much better. I thought I would miss teaching because I did enjoy the actual teaching bit. But now doing school events, I get to do all the fun stuff without any of the bureaucracy, and that's marvellous. It's completely different. But it's quite handy sometimes having been a teacher because you do get the odd class who are a little bit lively. And I've got no compunction about saying, be quiet and listen, or you won't get anything out of this.
Yeah.
And I think for some authors who don't have any experience of being in front of a class, it probably is quite, well, some classes are quite, can be quite intimidating even to me. But yeah, I've obviously got more experience in dealing with classes and jollying them along or making them listen and not being afraid if they do make a noise. It's worse if they sit there in silence. That's a really scary bit.
Do you prefer primary or secondary schools for your visit?
Primary is much easier. I'm pretty confident I can take a primary class along with me wherever I want to go, but it makes me work harder to go to secondary schools, and that's a good thing. You need to be challenged, mustn't get complacent.
Yeah. So sorry, I interrupted you there. Back to lockdown.
What am I missing? I'm missing seeing my daughter. I'm missing just wandering to shop now. Yeah, swimming. I like swimming. I go swimming 2 or 3 times a week. So that's something I'm missing. And I'm not going in the sea, not in Edinburgh. No. Not unless we have a real heat wave. But my garden has never looked tidier.
And what has been the best thing for you about this experience?
I suppose having more time to write, though I haven't been able to make as much use of it as I thought. Speaking to other authors online, I think quite a few of us, in terms of fiction, it's quite difficult to engage with the imaginary world in the way we normally do.
Mm-hmm.
The gardening's been fun. Cooking's been fun. Having my son take over some of the cooking has been marvellous. He's a very good cook, very imaginative, and it's nice not to have to think of so many meals. So I've enjoyed that bit very much. And it's forced me to get a bit more tech savvy. I'm absolutely rubbish at all this stuff, but now I can Zoom, I can house party, I've been in Microsoft Teams, all sorts of things like that. So that's quite a revelation to me.
I think the world will be a slightly changed place, won't it, afterwards?
Oh, I think so, yes. But I'm finding the science of all this absolutely riveting. That is, it sounds really weird to say, that's one of the best things about it, is just seeing the science unfolding in front of us at a rate that you don't normally see, and seeing people become a bit more scientifically literate, but realizing that really a lot of people aren't. So I'm very pleased that at the moment, I've just begun to write a new non-fiction book, which is going to be about microbes.
Oh, fantastic. And do you think you would write specifically about COVID-19?
It's not going to be focused on that at all, but it would be idiotic not to have something about it in there. So that, of course, will be the last bits that get written, because things change so fast.
Mm-hmm.
But microbes is actually, it's something I've been very interested in for a long time. And one of the first non-fiction books I did was about microbes. And I knew from teaching it was one of the topics that kids really loved, absolutely loved. But it's not always easy to convince publishers about that.
Right.
But yes, all the yuck stuff and the gore and death, they like a bit of that.
I've seen quite a few ebooks for children that are fiction as a kind of reassurance for how to cope with the lockdown on an emotional level. But I haven't seen any ebooks that have been non-fiction based that have been kind of explaining the science of what's going on.
Well, the Nosy Crow one, I think, did quite well at explaining in very simple terms what coronavirus was.
Oh, I haven't seen that one. I'll look that up. Thank you.
No, it's super. It's illustrated by, oh, help, I should know. Do I mean Tony Ross? Do I mean Axel Scheffler? It's really beautifully illustrated and was brought out in incredibly quick turnaround. They did a fantastic job with that.
Oh,
and
brilliant.
I think it's been translated into lots of languages. So I think that's doing a very, very good job in giving children something they can understand in the short term about what's going on.
I think it's so crucial to explain to children, isn't it? Because they do. I think people have a fear that children can't embrace difficult topics, but actually,
they absolutely can. They absolutely can.
How hard do you find it to explain quite difficult concepts in terms that children can understand? In
science, it seems to be something that I'm reasonably good at doing. Probably the 30 years of teaching helps there, but you're always just trying to fillet things out so you get the main ideas across, but not simplify things so much that it becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm glad I can address with this book, I'm slightly worried we're going to have a whole generation of kids who are completely neurotic about microbes.
Yeah.
And the fact is that the vast majority are either harmless or helpful or even vital to us. And I think that is going to need a bit of emphasis.
Oh, brilliant. That is good news. I think with anything, we need that balance, don't we? And
yeah,
I think you're absolutely right to have that concern that children are going to worry about being dirty and washing their hands all the time. Catherine, thank you. You've commented that it was Axel Scheffler.
Thank you.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So what would be your top survival tip? What is getting you through Corona time? Obviously, you're gardening, but if you know, what
books,
tips?
Reading. I've not been so desperate. I've done the housework yet. That'll be a long time before the house is spring cleaned. But I have cleaned all my bookshelves. I've had every book out and dusted it, and found some old friends that I forgot I had. So reading is one thing. Being out in the fresh air when I can. I'm terribly lucky. I've got my husband and my son in the house with me, and the geriatric cat. Just trying to look beyond what's going on and thinking that it's almost like when you have a new baby, the initial bit just seems to go on forever, and all they do is cry and want fed and need their nappy changed and wake up. And then once you get through the other side, you realise actually it didn't last for very long at all. So I keep thinking about that and thinking that the time is perhaps going very slowly just now, but in retrospect, hopefully it won't seem as bad as it does now. And it will get back to some sort of lovely normal, and we'll all appreciate the little things a bit more.
Absolutely. I hope so. Well, thank you so much, Gill. It's been an absolute joy talking to you, and I've really learned an awful lot about non-fiction books, so thank you. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me drone on.
Oh, not at all, not at all. So I will share your website in our Facebook group. And if you want to find out more about Gill's books, then you can go and have a look there. I meant to say, actually, I had great success teaching with one of your books, the Panda Party. The giant panda picture book.
Oh yes, yeah, picture books. That's another thing that was difficult to do. Yeah, that was fun, and great illustrations with that one as well.
Yeah, that was lovely. So thank you. Go and check out Gill's website. I'll post the link in the Facebook group, and come and join my Facebook group called Bringing Up Book Lovers. It's aimed at parents, helping parents to motivate their children to read. And tomorrow I'll be back with a slightly different interview tomorrow. I am not interviewing an author. I'm interviewing my local children's bookseller. So he will be brilliant for recommending books for your child. So come and join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. on my YouTube channel and on Facebook page, Lockdown Children's Lit Fest. Thank you, Gill.
Thank you, Catherine. Bye.
Bye.